because I can't remember all the wonderful information that he is sharing and stories. And I think we're going to be very excited. And we're recording today's class. I unfortunately have an emergency. I need to leave. So I'm very grateful that he's given us permission to record because I was so looking forward to this class. And next week, Daniel will be with us one day before he leaves for Rome. And so you'll see his topic and it's delightful. I said, don't write a description, just give me the title. And so he'll be with, Daniel will be here with us. And then, of course, Jordan will be back with us too. And so you have a little visual. He's going to give you a nice review. And welcome to those of you who have not been at the other two sessions too. So he'll bring you up. Take care. Bye-bye. Okay, bye.
All right, here we go. So in our first session, we covered the rise and moral fall of the Roman Republic. We saw how this small city government was scaled up haphazardly in an ad hoc fashion, leading to systems and behaviors that are perhaps not the most efficient, not the most administratively sound, but make the most sense if you are a small government trying to do the most with the least effort. In the second session, we followed how Judea, through the malcontentedness of its own local population, was transitioned away from being a client state of the Romans towards being a Roman province properly, and how, in many cases, that was a much worse experience for everyone all around. We saw how garrisons were placed in Judea. We saw how the tax farmers would be raking through the province like they rake through every province. We saw the expectations of loyalty oaths to a government that they had no particular sympathy for. And we saw how the Romans genuinely had a deep-seated suspicion of Judaism writ large, both in Judea and in the many Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire. We concluded by noting that, to a large extent, up until something I introduced as the Great Fire, it does not seem to me that the Romans are significantly distinguishing Christianity from Judaism. That Christianity is a kind of strange little cult within this problem faith and not something really distinct. And it is today in this series that we finally then get to Christianity proper as a faith tradition in itself, and not just a strange cult in Judaism. Now, the fate of the Jews, who embark on a grand revolt against Roman authority within a decade, around 66 or so, is incredibly fascinating, but it diverges here from our main subject. Now, let's turn back to 64 or so. In this year, a great fire broke out in Rome, destroying 2/3 of the city, and 3 of its 14 districts were utterly destroyed. When I mean destroyed, I mean leveled. There was nothing left. Now, many historians say this was inevitable. The city was increasingly packed and dense. We hear that the fire begins around the Circus Maximus, the big arena where they race the chariots. There's too many shops there carrying too many flammable goods that are just tossing things up in the storeroom haphazardly. The entire area is a fire hazard. This was going to happen sooner or later. The destruction is horrific, and the most famous historian of this event, Tacitus, notes that at the time, rumors abounded as to how and why this fire really got started. Many blamed the Emperor Nero himself, who would go on to take much of this destroyed land and build a gigantic palace for himself, the ruins of which you can still see in Rome. At the time, Nero appears to have reacted to the fire responsibly. He moved quickly to alleviate the burden of homelessness and starvation it placed on the population, making his own personal resources available to those who needed it. Still, the rumor grew that he was behind it, and a scapegoat became necessary. Tacitus tells us that Nero blamed the Christians and began the first major persecutions of the Christians, and not the Jews, but directly the Christians in Roman history. Tacitus writes in his Annales, consequently, to get rid of the rumor, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty of death during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of this evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, serving as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the Circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. Now, for the Romans, death as a spectacle is nothing new. By this time, gladiatorial games are standardized. Those themselves emerge from ritual funerary combat. Mass executions and crucifixions are again standardized. We see them for centuries before this time. For example, when the famous slave revolt of Spartacus is put down, they crucify the prisoners that they capture in the final battle for miles along the roads leading into Rome with signs bragging about which general managed to finally defeat Spartacus. So this is nothing new for the Romans, but the excessiveness of Nero seems to be somewhat distasteful. Right? But we'll note that Tacitus doesn't like Christians. He's not saying, oh, these poor people. He's saying, man, I really hate these people, but even they might not deserve this. Now, we also must remember that Tacitus hated Nero particularly, and was, of course, predisposed to believe that Nero was actually the guilty one. Now, why was Nero a hated figure? Well, Nero had some interesting hobbies. He liked to dress up like an actor. He liked to get on stage and put on public performances. This made him quite loved by the masses of poor Romans. But because he was using often public funds to do this, the aristocracy could not stand him. So anyone who was halfway educated in the Roman world thought that this was a shameful thing, that their head of state should absolutely be nothing, having to do nothing nearby with. It's the attitude of the majority of our historical sources that this man was some kind of a degenerate. Whether it's fair or not has been intensely debated. Now, moving on to the persecutions, we have to pause and ask, why blame the Christians? Why not blame the Jews? Blaming Jewish populations for this or that problem was commonplace by this time in Roman history. And we have already gone over how they were expelled from the city several times before. Christians were a tiny sect, a minority of a minority in the city, and it is very unlikely that most Romans could discern between Christians and Jews at the time of the Great Fire. Some scholars assert that it's actually rather remarkable that Nero even knew what a Christian was at all. Tacitus clearly knows who they are, but Tacitus was born in 56 and was writing around 110 AD. He's way after the fact.
All right. What's the data for saying that there were only infinitesimal number of Christians in Rome in the 60s?
One scholar says that in the entire world, around 100, there are only around 10,000 Christians. All right. So if we mark that back by 50 years, maybe
in a specific location.
In a specific location. So the number of them in the city is tiny. Right? If we assume that Paul has had reasonably equal successes in his ministrations to the various Greek cities in Anatolia, in Judea itself, we're looking at maybe 1,000 or 2,000 in Rome at the best possible case when this is breaking out in a city of several 100,000 minimally, if not more than that. I mean, this is a very small group of people who don't have any significant power, right? Most Romans don't really even understand Judaism. So for them to understand the intricacies of Judaism to the extent that they understand the cults within Judaism is a tall ask. Now, there is actually a pretty good theory as to how Nero knew about the Christians and why the Jews in this instance escaped blame. This theory has a name, and it's Poppaea Sabina, wife of Nero. The Jewish historian Josephus met this woman and was so sufficiently impressed by her that he called her a Theosebes, a God-fearer, a term he uses for Jews in every other instance except when talking about Poppaea. Of course, therefore, scholars have always wondered, is the Empress of Rome Jewish? On evidence, maybe, but it seems unlikely. The image that we get of Poppaea is of someone really into astrology and other Eastern practices. For my money, she kind of seems like some kind of Roman Gwyneth Paltrow figure who's really into the hip new spiritual but not religious crazes coming in from the far provinces, right? As Tacitus says, Rome is where bad ideas go to become popular. This woman was into all kinds of exotic and esoteric practices. We hear about many, and clearly she had a soft spot for Judaism in particular. She previously had interceded on behalf of Jews in earlier tensions for the Jewish population in Rome and in Jerusalem itself. She interfered with Roman administration in Judea province on behalf of the Jews. It has been suggested that Poppaea interceded in what may well have been another scapegoating of the Jews in the city, deflecting blame onto a subgroup of Jews unpopular among the other Jews. According to this theory, Poppaea swayed Nero into blaming the Christians specifically. In any case, the Christians were blamed by Nero, and the first wave of Christian-specific persecutions began. Tacitus told us what shape this took: violent spectacle deaths designed to terrorize the community. Now, as I've mentioned in response to the question, we don't really know how many Christians there were in Rome. It's very difficult to say how many Christians were killed because there's only 10,000 around the year 100, according to Rodney Stark. We can probably say there's a few hundred who were killed in this persecution, and that's the safest I want to speculate with. That said, some scholars have recently attempted to undermine the historicity of the persecution entirely. This has so far failed to be convincing. The majority position in scholarship remains that the accounts of Tacitus, backed up by a later historian, Suetonius, are valid in attestations of a brutal and violent period of public executions of Christians. Why would the Romans go along with this? They are usually thought of as being a fairly tolerant people. We covered a little bit of this last time. Generally speaking, Romans did not outright ban religions or religious rites for almost anyone in their empire. That said, there were some exceptions. The first known case of this, 200 years earlier, around 186 BC, pertains to a Greek cult of Bacchus that was partaking in ecstatic rituals involving alcohol-fueled depravities, which induced a moral panic so severe that the Roman Senate enacted a law that decreed death to anyone participating in these rites beyond a certain number or scope, i.e., it was not even banned totally, but just reduced to a manageable facet. You can only have 3 people at your orgy, not 25. Make it work, right?
So that's where Emily Post got the.
This ban was not because the religion was foreign or because it was Greek, but seemingly out of a concern of the damage that such practices would do to society. The religion was suppressed, seemingly successfully. In the reign of Augustus, another prescription was enacted. But this again has little to do with events in Rome. The rites of the Druids, popular in the northern provinces, were banned. This was because they practiced mass human sacrifice, and there were further accusations of cannibalism. Again, the social harm in these things seems clear to me. But what about Christianity? It doesn't appear that they were cutting people apart or engaging in mass orgies. So what was the problem with them? Well, Even the Romans didn't seem to fully understand what was wrong with them. Consider the writings of Pliny the Younger, a participant in anti-Christian persecutions taking place a couple decades after this. Pliny the Younger writes to Emperor Trajan, asking for advice on how to best persecute Christians. A few paragraphs of this, but if you wanted the Roman perspective of Christians, here it is. Pliny to Emperor Trajan, "It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature, whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be a Christian, whether the name itself, even without offenses, or only the offenses associated with the name, are to be punished. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed, for I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Soon, accusations spread, as usually happens, because of the proceedings going on, and several incidents occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods. And moreover, they cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These, I thought, should be discharged. Others, named by the informer, declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been but had ceased to be, some 3 years before, or many years, some as much as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and statues of the gods and cursed Christ. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. I therefore postponed the investigation and hastened to consult you, for the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially because of the number involved. For many persons of every age, every rank, and also both sexes are and will be endangered. For the contagion of this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but to the villages and the farms. But it seems possible to check and cure it. It is certainly quite clear that the temples, which have been almost deserted, have begun to be frequented, and that the established religious rites, long neglected, are being resumed, and that from everywhere sacrificial animals are coming, for which until now very few purchases could be found. Hence, it is easy to imagine what a multitude of people can be reformed if an opportunity for repentance is afforded. There's a few issues that help us understand this matter. Understanding what the Romans are thinking of these people. If we recall the New Testament, it is clear that becoming a Christian represents, in a number of passages, a kind of schism between the convert and their family and community. In a sense, becoming a Christian is akin to the rejection of traditional boundaries of societies. We must remember that for ancient paganism, ancient sacrificial rituals, which Christians refused to partake in, were means by which communities asserted their cohesive togetherness identity. An animal was killed and communally eaten. In the Christian refusal to partake in these rituals, they represented an obviously antisocial force. Now, one could say that the Jews similarly refused to partake in these things, and indeed they did, and they were seriously distrusted and scapegoated for this. But Christianity was also a proselytizing religion. It is Judaism metastasizing. A Jew might sit out a ritual and be thought antisocial, but a Christian was doing the same thing and trying to get your son, your wife, your brother to be just as antisocial as they were, with some success. Further, Christianity, as it grew early on, increasingly was in competition with other growing faiths. In the first century, the fastest growing religion in Rome was not Christianity. It was the imperial cult. Christian refusal to participate in this set them opposed not just to their local societies, but opposed to the larger political and state structures that dominated their world. If we go with some scholarly interpretations of Revelation and Esdras as explicitly anti-Roman, it seems that an antisocial sentiment pervaded at least some Christian converts. And as their numbers grew, it can be assumed that Romans picked up on this. Now, Nero wouldn't last much longer than his persecutions. The empire exploded into a multi-sided civil war in 68-69, which saw Nero take his own life and saw various Roman generals declare themselves emperor before successively being killed themselves in a kind of truncated Game of Thrones. Rome itself burned again, this time as part of the war, with their most important sacred site, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, having been burned as part of it. The eventual victor in all this was Vespasian, the veteran general who crushed the Jewish revolt that I had mentioned earlier. In the reign of Vespasian's son Domitian, we hear some hazy accounts that there was another wave of persecutions, but because the records for Domitian's reign are hazy and unclear, the reasons and outcome of this, as well as its basic historicity at all, is fiercely disputed. Christian persecution was a sporadic but recurring occurrence throughout the empire in the 2nd century. But despite the terror the state clearly intended to inflict, the faith continued to spread gradually across the Roman world. Trajan's persecutions, which are what Pliny is taking part in, were based on a kind of don't ask, did not have the administrative depth to go in and root out a spreading ideology among its subjects. We have established in the first talk how the governmental form of the Republic in its transition to the empire creates these kinds of ad hoc systems that don't allow for a holistic form of rule. There is no Roman bureau of religious persecution, as it were. If Christians were stirring up trouble in an area, i.e. by publicly castigating the faiths of others and thereby disturbing the peace, that was when you went after them. This led to death, yes, but it was a kind of half-hearted persecution. As we see with Pliny, it's hard to hate people who don't seem to be doing anything wrong. Entirely ignoring the accounts of early church fathers and their saintly activities, it's okay, biased sources, we'll leave them aside for now, I'm a classicist, right? From the Roman perspective themselves, we get a sense that the Christians are not Dionysiac cultists having orgies and ripping animals apart. They are not druids stuffing people into big wicker men and lighting them on fire. And if they were like Jews, they don't seem to be causing military problems like Jews do in any particular capacity. Their opposition to the state, being seemingly good-natured and nonviolent, was clearly winning them a good deal of sympathy. What seems to happen as the religion grows into the 3rd century is a sudden burst of conversion. Christian authors like Tertullian began to soften up on the topic of the empire, and the empire softens up on them in turn. This is largely, however, because for most of the 3rd century, there is not much of an empire to speak of. The infamous crisis of the 3rd century, which I have on the board here, was a 50-year period whereby Roman central control imploded into countless civil wars. 24 separate emperors rose and fell in this period, and the model of imperial rule initiated by Augustus was lastingly destroyed, to be replaced by something far more medieval looking. The integrated networks of Roman trade, the unwalled cities that marked out the Roman peace, were a thing of the past, and the world became far more localized, with local power holders entrenching themselves in fortified positions across the Roman world. Crisis of the third century is absolutely fascinating. You basically see medieval Europe before Rome even falls. In a period of intense terror and uncertainty, a redemptive faith like Christianity, already present in every corner of the empire in some capacity, spread rapidly. We see a key parallel with this in China, actually. The rise of Buddhism occurs in a rapid capacity after the Han Dynasty begins to collapse. Right? You have the exact same dynamics going on where the government is no longer what you can trust. The government had tried to claim religious supremacy and centrality in your life, but clearly there's civil wars going off left, right, and center. Life is becoming nasty, brutal, and short, and people turn to this idea of you have to give us some kind of alternative.
Jordan, what's the data for the widespread presence of believers in diverse elements of the empire? It sounds as if they go from 10,000 in 100 to widespread all over the place.
I think I have that statistic later on here. Let me check. Yeah, by around 300, they're 10% of the entire population. 10% of the entire Roman world.
Yeah, but Gallup had not been invented by then. How do they determine?
When you are doing archaeology and you are excavating a certain settlement, you sort of see how much space is devoted to certain faiths. You sort of see if temples have fallen into abeyance or not, right? You can begin to identify tombs sometimes by religious affiliation. And so you play quantitative games. Obviously, 10% is not a Gallup poll, hard statistic, Census Bureau number. It's an estimation, right? Obviously, there's so much archaeology to be done. This number could change significantly up or down if we had the money to excavate every single Roman ruin that we knew existed. This is what Stark, check the name for it. His work is based on that.
Are the church fathers writing by this time so that we can also get a sense of?
Depends on which church father you mean. I mean, Tertullian is writing.
Tertullian, Eusebius?
Eusebius comes a bit later, if I recall.
Papias?
I'm afraid I don't know the dates of Papias off the top of my head.
I think he's way earlier. The only stuff that survives from him is quoted in Eusebius. My only point is that are the church fathers like Paul writing to the Christians in Syria to say, hey guys, it looks like you're doing pretty well and we're delighted to hear it. That would be another data point.
Yeah, from the church fathers that I have read, because remember, I am a classicist and not a theologian. So I am far more interested, generally speaking, in the pagans in this time period. You do begin to see that they are making their way into the system, as it were, right? You begin to see evidence for Christian soldiers. You begin to see evidence for Christian administrators. That's going to be dealt with a little later on. But it is something that is now no longer this freakish background footnote like Christianity is in the first century.
But I guess what he's looking for, is there a tipping point?
Define tipping point.
Well, a tipping point is where suddenly you just get this mass shift, like there was a tipping point where America turned towards gay marriage. Right?
I would argue that the crisis of the third century is that tipping point. Right? That's when, if we think of the pre-crisis Roman government as the primary religious focus of Roman life, right? Where everybody is supposed to be worshiping the emperor because the emperor is what guarantees peace and stability and security for you, and the emperor seems to have the power of a god in the mortal world. The crisis of the third century shows that that's hollow, right? And there is nothing that the Roman state can offer to replace it.
So both religions and the political stability of the empire collapsing, do you think that led people to convert to something that transcended?
I wouldn't say I think that, I'd say I know that. I think that's the closest to a fact that we ever get to see in ancient
That
history.
was going on, but is that a causal?
Yeah. Oh, we see that a lot. When we ever see political disturbances or instability, we often see upticks in either cultic activity or major religious reforms going on as part of it, because religion is always tied to political structure, and political structures failing force religions to adapt. If the Roman imperial cult cannot adapt because it is married to the Roman state in particularly unique ways, it just cannot meet the needs of its subjects anymore, which means they start looking around for something else. All right, moving right along. Let's see, where were we? Yes. So by the end of the 3rd century, as I said, there were millions of Christians throughout the empire. This is all something that exploded over the crisis of the 3rd century, amounting to between 5 and 10% of the population, according to Winter. Authors like Tertullian should be read in this context, arguing that Christians suffer alongside the empire and that their mistreatment is unjust, and that the empire is itself not a bad thing per se. While anti-Christian sentiment continued, and there was no less intense outbreaks of violence when it did break out, the trajectory of the demographic is clearly shifting by all our evidence. Tertullian's writings and other sources highlight continued persecutions, however. These persecutions during the crisis were notably haphazard, varying in intensity based on region, and certainly not scalable empire-wide amid the crisis itself when there is no unified empire. For example, when Valerian took over as emperor, he attempted to make Christianity punishable by death in 258, but then he gets captured by the Parthians in 260 and the order goes unenforced. Right? Situations like this are happening constantly. It's not that in the crisis of the 3rd century, the government takes a significantly more benevolent stance on Christian. They don't have the means to even do what they had to do before. You can't go after everyone in the empire because you don't control the empire, and your needs for men and loyalty and resources override everything else. Right? The end of the crisis brings about the last of the major persecutions of Christians, this time under Emperor Diocletian. This is by far the most serious. The crisis of the 3rd century is a time of rapid militarization of the Roman government, and civil administration was increasingly being replaced by military dictator-style emperors, whose authority was derived from the men under them with swords. Diocletian, the man who ultimately resolves the crisis, then breaks the empire in half because it was too big, determined that he also then later determined that the destruction of the Christians was not to be don't ask, don't tell, but is a matter of top state priority. He and his successors purged the army of Christians, condemned faiths like Manichaeanism that mixed Christianity and other Eastern faiths into a new religion, and he empowered men throughout his administration who explicitly held Christianity in disdain. Diocletian had an empire to restore, and felt that by enforcing religious unity throughout the Roman Empire, he could help return it to its golden age, which was by then very long past. By this time, it is well clear that Christianity had been conceptually separated out from Judaism, as the latter was no longer seen as particularly concerning. The Jews were not really a political threat, and their faith was not one that could threaten the foundations of empire. This other faith, this group that was now surpassing 10% of the population and still growing across the empire, was a separate concern entirely. Christian temples were razed, scriptures burned, Christian freed slaves re-enslaved. Eusebius tells us that, around this time, that so many Christians filled the jails that they had to let criminals out to make room. In this era, we hear many stories of martyrdom of the early church fathers. For a classicist, we take most of these as fictitious and probably exaggerated. However, some scholars who attempt to discredit the brutality of the persecution in toto have failed. Certainly, many died, and many did so nobly, dying not for their own crimes, as much as the danger that they represented to an empire that was coming apart anyway. From their vantage points, Diocletian probably thought that Christianity was headed towards oblivion if his government could only stay the course. Society was being effectively purged of Christian elements. The split of the empire into two parts, East and West, was to prove Christianity's salvation. Constantine, the son of Constantius, took over in the East and seized an opportunity to depict himself as a liberator and bring Christians onto his side like an ancient version of a bellflower decoration. Or, perhaps, he genuinely believed that the Christian God had guided him to victory over his opponents. When he and colleagues came forward with the Edict of Milan in 314, it marked the end of Christianity being on the defensive, and marks not just Roman official and explicit toleration, but restitution as well. Constantine's enemies, most prominently Maximianus Daza in the East, therefore persecuted Christianity with renewed fervor while still able, but he was ultimately defeated by Valerius Licinius, a colleague and rival of Constantine, who Constantine later defeated and executed in 324. Constantine would go on to embrace Christianity, and he initiated a new era of emperors sacking and oppressing pagans. And his son, Constantine II, would order pagan temples shut and pagan practices worthy of death sentences in themselves. And now many Christians, Roman Christians, would vandalize pagan shrines and antagonize pagans as individuals, leading eventually to the reign of Theodosius, during which time Christianity became the official faith of the empire. It is not my aim here to get into the grit of Christianity and its transformation under the Romans once it becomes a state faith. These matters are often and better discussed by the church and are explicitly matters of church history. Instead, after these three lectures, I would hope that you see that Christianity's birth from its Jewish origins, its rises, its falls, its victories and defeats, occur in an explicitly Roman context. It is fine to say all is as God willed it to be, but God works in the realm of men, and the rise of Christianity occurred in the realm of the Romans. It was by Roman laws, according to Roman concerns, subject to Roman prejudices, that Christianity was shaped in its earliest experiences. Roman imperial household drama shaped it when the Christians were targeted as scapegoats for the Great Fire. Roman lackadaisical administrative structures are on full display in stop-and-go persecution waves, and how the Christians endured don't ask, don't tell. And Christianity benefited from Roman administrative limitations when its greatest enemy, Diocletian, felt the empire too big to govern, and so divided it in half, creating the opening into which someone like Constantine could emerge. And as a side note, Diocletian is wrong. The empire is not too big to govern. We know this because China is bigger, but Chinese solutions are make a big bureaucratic administration, which the Romans will not do because they have small government. You reach the limits of a Roman ideology and its capacity to govern large bodies of land. Now, where was I? As Christianity grew as a faith and spread across an empire that was falling apart, responding to the needs of desperate people looking for answers when their faith in the empire had failed them, it grew as a faith of Romans, Jewish in origin, but by the 4th century, distinctly and completely, something entirely different. Even in the ugliness that we Christians prefer to skip over in the persecutions by Christians of pagans, resulting in the destruction of architecture, culture, and philosophy, we see Roman behaviors. I conclude with this. Any who would answer the call of Jesus and walk his path must find a way to reconcile themselves to the fact that the road they walk was built and paid for by Caesar. There you go. Now I'll open it up to questions.
So I kind of naively thought that, as compared to Christians in this era, pagans are not very serious in terms of their religiosity. That Christians, in contrast, really thought there was Jesus, really thought there was Yahweh, and conducted themselves accordingly. Pagans, on the other hand, I've always understood paganism to be more of a performative art, so that we have to do these observance things, but everybody knows there isn't really some guy with a big beard on Olympus or et cetera, et cetera. So is my assumption, like so many of mine, false?
I think that you might want to reevaluate that position, although there are some sources in which you do get the sense that the writer doesn't believe in any of this hokum about Zeus on Mount Olympus. That's true. That said, there's a number of factors that you need to consider before you just label all pagans as sort of cynically pretending, right? First of all, especially by the time we get to Diocletian, paganism is now reacting to Christianity. And just like the Crusaders made Islam more violent, the Christian capacity for organization and demands of exclusivity and faith are prompting a kind of pushback and assertion of the old ways. You do get people like Julian the Apostate, who genuinely believes in Zeus and wants these people destroyed and bring the old ways back. So you have people like that. Secondly, it's very tempting for people who only want to read the so-called classics of Greece and Rome to get the intellectual perspective and forget common people, right? That Greek philosophers or Roman emperors might be more skeptical usually of the gods does not mean that the majority of people are, right? When we read things like Roman soldiers' letters and such, they seem to have a much more real, grounded sense of the faith. Right? Furthermore, the Romans, and especially the Greeks before them, since you're talking about paganism as a whole, will fight entire holy wars, right? The sacred wars, of which there are 4 in classical Greece, are fought over religious violations. And beyond that, you have things that are close to like a crusade, when the oracle of Delphi declares that Cyrene needs to be taken and the local people thrown out. And so you have this sort of like religious sanctification for this battle. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, engages in a battle with the Phocians, where he dresses his soldiers up like avatars of Apollo because the Phocians are blasphemers. And he makes sure to like actually go out of his way to make a spectacle of drowning all of the prisoners alive, because that's the punishment of blasphemy. And like all the Greeks like that, right? The intensity of belief of paganism is something that is activated differently, not that it is not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I didn't know about those wars. That's a really good explanation. Is it possible? Okay, so the thesis is that the conflict from the 1st to the 3rd century is in part between sincere religious beliefs. Okay, that was your point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it explained as well by saying it's the struggle between the established power structure, the morphing of paganism into the imperial cult, versus the uprising or insurgent group of Christians, about whom I guess I incorrectly felt that only one side of that conflict was sincere. I guess what you're saying is both sides may have been sincere, but these people had the power, the pagans, and didn't want to give it up.
Yeah, I think that's much closer to the truth. Your hand is up, right?
I think I was just going to jump in to say that perhaps, I mean, I think of the United States, and once a religion is a national religion, you'll have a lot of people who will just show up because they're supposed to show up.
Yes.
1950s USA, every lawyer and doctor had to be going to a Presbyterian church because that's what you do, and you show up on Sundays, and whether it's very personal or real to you or not, maybe some of that was going on too.
Oh, definitely. I'm not going to say that every pagan who made a sacrifice to Caesar genuinely believed in the divine capacity of Caesar. I think that's far from the truth. But I also would separate the imperial cult out from the cult of the divinities. I'm not sure that a Roman believes in the divinity of Caesar with the same emphasis they might believe in the divinity of Jupiter, right? And even if you don't believe that Jupiter is a manifested being that can come and appear in front of you in your dreams or something, that doesn't necessarily you don't believe in a force called Jupiter that's out there somewhere, right? It's a bias that we have resulting from the victory of Christianity, that we see paganism as this sort of nonsensical set of beliefs that surely no one really ever believed in. But I think that is to let modernity blind us from the way antiquity actually functioned. Furthermore, because Roman religion, like many ancient religions, is bound very closely to the governance of the larger state structure, it's difficult for us who live in a post-medieval European world that sort of highlighted the difference between church and state to see state operations as religious. And yet, if you do not see the religious elements in play in Roman government, you will not understand Roman governance, right? Before they do anything, they consult with priests. Before they go to battle, they read the guts of the animals for signs that the gods are with them. We hear that the Greeks do the same thing. If the signs are not good, they will not fight. You can say it's all cynical, right? Well, okay, if it's all cynical and no one believes this, why are they bothering? Right? You can say the general might be cynical, he's doing it because the soldiers believe, but then the soldiers still believe. Right? Enough people think that this is some kind of significant capacity activity that even if the people at the top may be cynical, because we always suspect the people at the top of being the most cynical, you still have to do it.
Well, so I suppose to me what's interesting is what are the features of Christianity that we have this day that are rooted in that transitional period. There are two things for sure going on that jump out to me. One is that when the Roman Empire moved to Constantinople, they created a form of Christianity where there's absolutely no distinction between the church and state. The church and the state were one and the same. However, in the Roman side of the world, when Rome collapsed, the Roman government in Italy, government out of Rome collapsed, and the church remained, you had a hybrid where the church existed outside of the state.
Yeah.
It influenced the state, the many states that existed, but it existed as a separate entity. So that's one thing and so you see that to this day, you see this back and forth ebb and flow of, how much should the state and the church be in cahoots together and how much should they be separate. The other thing that jumps out to me is it jumped out to me when I first visited Rome. It was all of a sudden obvious that the Roman Catholic Church absorbed the iconography of the Roman religion. So, the first one that I recognized was the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins just became nuns. It's the same thing. They dress the same, they have the same beliefs, the same practices, only they switched from a Roman creed to a Christian creed. And so that business of moving into a pagan universe, and rather than destroying the pagan religion, baptizing it instead. And so that's something that we see even to this day, where Christianity moves into an organization, into place, and absorbs the practices without it destroying.
I mean, this is the very Christian perspective to take on these events. You're right, you're not wrong, but there's another side to this, right? Which is, you could say that when Christianity becomes Roman, it becomes a Roman faith, right? So the attitudes, demeanors, and large-scale cultural perspective of the Romans does not die necessarily with the state as long as their state religion endures, right? And I want to tread carefully because I don't want to just publicly bash the Catholic Church too much. But I think you can see in a lot of the darker elements of Catholic behavior towards other faiths, towards any kind of form of blasphemy, that you're seeing concerns and activities of the Roman state that have never really gone away, right? That Rome's desire to control, to make everything sort of function within its administrative sphere lives on in them, right? And so does it make the religion invalid? No, but I mean, it's when you,
exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
So what are the elements of Christianity which really aren't Christian, that are toxic things that we absorbed and practice, that really, if you stop and said, hey, is this the message of the gospel? You would say,
Toxic is a relative concept. I mean, like there would be some people who say that, Christianity is toxic because that's a pagan holiday and it's not really, I mean, you can go to the extremes with this. I would say that concepts.
I would say burning somebody at the stake is
Yes, I would agree with that. And again, the desire for uniformity comes from making the religion a religion of the state, because the state needs submission, whereas the faith only necessarily needs belief or at least ritual conduct in some capacity. Right? A faith alone can sustain itself much easier. Yep.
So would the worshiping of saints fall into this category? That seems polytheistic to me. Well, again, adopting the practice of worshiping the gods.
While I am not a specialist in Catholic theology, as someone who works on paganism, that particular practice does seem to me to be disturbingly similar. If there is a way to justify it that you would learn at some kind of Catholic church, I am not a Catholic priest well-versed in their dogma, so I don't know how they would explain that. But their absorption of sacred sites, as you mentioned, the Vestal Virgins converting into nuns, or in a roundabout way. Yes, there are all of these strange pagan forms that have persisted that are not. Yeah.
Santeria religions have returned to faith.
Yeah, true. It goes both ways. That paganism is alive and well within our faith, I think, is beyond question, right? How serious that is and how much of an emergency that is for us to consider and try to root out is, I think, every individual's own prerogative, right? I mean, I don't think Christianity is that much of a concern. I might think like believing too much in saints and Satan is a little bit more of a concern, and then believing in like the Crusades is another level of concern. It's where you personally feel you want your Christianity to be in terms of how Jewish you want to keep it, or how much you think that the Romans have benefited or drawn away from some kind of purity of the faith, if you believe in that kind of thing. I say that the faith's experience under Rome marks it, and we have to wrestle with it as it came, and that trying to pick out the Greek and the Roman parts of Christianity makes it unrecognizable even to us. And I think that means we have to just be more serious about the Greeks and the Romans, not that we just rip out all of our paganism, right?
So you've identified this, like these cultural blinders that I know I've inherited, where Roman pagans are either arch bad guys in the story, or like a caricature akin to Mel Brooks.
Okay.
World, right?
Yeah.
I can't unsee that. But you're a classicist, and like you said, you spend your time with these first, second, and third century pagans. So what do you think of these people and their culture and their worldview? Like, are they very sympathetic characters to you? Or are they very, like, tell me more about your interaction with people and culture.
I mean, that's a very difficult question, and it goes against what we historians are supposed to be trained to do, right? We're supposed to avoid trying to make moral judgments of the people that we work on. That said, no historian does this successfully, everybody does this. While as a Christian myself, I am obviously not appreciative of the activities of Trajan or Diocletian, I also understand that if I was a Roman back at that time, I probably would have massively appreciated Trajan and Diocletian, right? That we as Christians, when we are looking into the church fathers and such, we are looking into a very specific set of information. And we're not really asking what it was like to live in 325 or such. Trajan expands the empire to its largest extent. He defeats Parthia, right? Parthia, which had been a constant threat for centuries, which had obliterated entire Roman armies. He takes Mesopotamia and even leads Roman armies into Persia itself, right? It's astounding what that man manages to accomplish. Diocletian ends the crisis of the 3rd century, right? Even though it ends and it doesn't ever bring back citizen discourse and civil discourse, it at least ends this era of endless civil war and brutality, right? After 50 years of that, I think I'd be pretty tired of that too. And honestly, if I thought, or if the case was made to me that these Christian people are a danger of bringing those civil wars back again, I might be of the opinion that they just need to shut up, right? It's very easy for us to sit here in 2023 and say, in Los Angeles, California, oh, how dare these emperors do these horrible things to these people. It's difficult for us to imagine enduring decades of uncertainty or civil war, plagues, the inability to travel when you knew that your immediate ancestors could travel freely, the destruction of the economic network. This really has a way of changing what people think is okay or not. Right. As for Nero, I'm not a particular fan. I don't like that entire dynasty. I think they're all corrupt, and that's because I'm a fan of the Republic. If you want to ask about a specific figure, I could give you my specific opinion. But as for paganism writ large, there is an emphasis on communality in paganism, which I think is positive. There are sides of it here and there that I quite like. There is a belief that stems from the Greeks and later taken up by the Romans that sacrifice needs to be done with a willing participant, right? That you're supposed to sort of come into a kind of communality, not just with your community, but even with the sacrifice itself, right? It manages to bind a community to a sort of traditional set of values that keeps things together, which makes even more sense in the ancient world when you have state-like entities that are at the level of community. So imagine everyone to your left and to your right being responsible for defending the country of Brentwood, right? Gathering together becomes that much more important. Right. We have the luxury of knowing there's an army out there consisting of faceless individuals. Some of us may know one or two of, and they're probably all from other states. If you look to your left and to your right and you know this is who we have, the emphasis on staying together and asserting a kind of common consent becomes much more important, and paganism was very good at drawing that out. Does it get abused and manipulated by the power of sole rulers? Yes. I am not a fan necessarily of what the Roman emperors do with this, nor am I a fan of what Alexander the Great does with paganism and makes it a religion where you worship like living men. I think that's dangerous, but I don't think that's necessarily inherent in paganism. Does that answer your question without taking too much air out of the room for anybody else? In the back.
Did you say Christianity made Islam more violent? It was kind of up here on the book that we said.
Yeah, when the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land, Islam was not as violent as it would become after centuries of facing it down.
I thought it was the 800 Islam.
It is a 800 thing, but the Crusades are like an around 1100 or so thing.
No, then I didn't understand how.
I'm not saying that Christianity leads to the rise of Islam, rather that it is something that creates a more violent bent. Yes, there were conquests of Islam before the Crusades. They were generally less violent than would be the case later on.
Okay,
Right.
I think it's just because of the Crusades, Islam, not that they were at the same time doing things.
What?
Never mind that question.
Okay. All right.
It made sense in my mind.
Okay.
Well, I would argue it takes two to tango.
It only takes one side to show up in another person's land with a gigantic army.
But Islam showed up in Europe before Europe showed up.
I would say that there was no larger concept of Europe. Are we going to debate the Crusades and immorality right now? That's quite a tangent.
No, finish that sentence.
History is history.
I want to hear it.
Yes, Islam arrives in Europe, but their goal is not to, take over all of Europe as some grand master plan as much as necessarily to spread their faith per se. They don't engage in massacres the way the early Crusaders did. Were they violent? Yes. Were they slaughter every living thing in the city of Jerusalem that's not making the sign of the cross? No, except for India, because they had a belief that the Indians were not people of the book and therefore totally savages and therefore should all be killed. But when they were encountering Christians and Jews, they had a much more civil demeanor in their conquest than was returned to them later on. Not the topic of this talk at all, but sure.
One question.
Yeah.
So Commodus, is he in this crisis?
Commodus would be right, let's see here, let's say 20, 30 years after Trajan persecution.
Before you go, favorite Roman movie? I gotta ask that. Well, answer the Commodus question, because Commodus brings up Gladiator. And
Yeah, okay. Honestly, my favorite Roman is Terramai Romai. Because I think it's absolutely hilarious. This is one that like only specialists know. There is a Japanese film about a Roman bath builder who is accidentally being transported in time back and forth from ancient Rome to modern Japan, and he gets inspiration for the baths that he's building for the Emperor Hadrian. And that time period in Rome is very faithfully recreated. I've watched it with like other specialists and my colleagues. And it's surprising because you never see this time period depicted, and they do a pretty good job in this hilarious, fantastical movie where our, accurately recreated Roman is going back to modern Japan and having all sorts of silly adventures. Then he goes back and Hadrian is talking about complicated politics that's like actually accurate. It's absolutely hilarious.
What is the name?
Terumai Romai.
I have to write
How do you
that.
spell that?
You wanna write that on?
Yeah.
I can visit.
It's in Japanese, and the main Roman actors are played by Japanese actors. It's the most surreal thing.
But with subtitles.
Yeah, you can get subtitles.
Roma is what that.
Yeah, Baths of Rome. Thermae Romae is the Latin, right? So in like,
So the Romans got their ideas for their baths from the modern Japanese.
well, the idea is not they had the ideas, but that this one guy is struggling with like a writer's block for building baths. And he, doesn't have any inspiration. All his work is stale until he sees the Japanese, and he builds these amazing baths based on what he's seeing in Japan.
Okay, so,
That's not a picture I can get out of.
bring you back to the topic of including though.
Yep.
What is your assessment of pre-Constantine? Why Christianity gained the foothold in a diverse element of a multicultural empire? Right, because we're talking, there are a lot of different ethnicities in the Roman Empire during this first through third century period. What accounts for I don't want to say explosive, but significant growth even before state sponsorship?
I think there's a number of things that go on with that. Like, what makes Christianity different? Number one, it's universalistic, right? It doesn't discriminate between ethnic groups. By the time you get to Paul, it's open to anybody. Number two, it is not secretive. There are certain things like mystery cults, which promise some kind of redemptive afterlife, but they're incredibly exclusive and expensive to get into. Number three, that it's redemptive at all, because the majority of pagans, I would say that they're not insincere about their beliefs, but most paganism views the afterlife as like this cold, dead place like Sheol of the Old Testament, right? It's nothing really to look forward to. And so what matters would be more this life, but especially if this life is a wreck, like in the crisis of the 3rd century, then you desperately turn for something to give your life meaning, right? And so Christianity is available, it is open, it promises what you need. And what's more, you also have traditions in Christianity that you saw early Christians ministering to the sick during the plagues. And again, the state wasn't doing this. The state's failures allowed Christianity to step in, right? Arguably, if the Roman Empire had stayed strong continuously for centuries and centuries, Christianity probably would not have grown to the size that it would have. But their total failure to address their declining empire meant that many services and needs of the population were filled by the Christians. Yeah. All right.